We have all heard the phrase a Pyrrhic victory. We use it today to describe a situation where you win the argument, you win the lawsuit, or you win the game, but the cost of that victory was so devastatingly high that it was essentially a defeat. It is winning the battle, but losing the war. But very few people know the man behind the phrase. His name was Pyrrhus of Epirus, and he was not just a cautionary tale about the cost of war. He was a Hellenistic warlord, an apex predator in a world entirely defined by violence. A few decades after his death, the legendary Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca, the man who would become Rome's greatest nightmare, was famously asked to rank the greatest military commanders in human history. Hannibal placed Alexander the Great at number 1, and at number 2, he placed Pyrrhus. Pyrrhus was actually a second cousin to Alexander the Great, and he lived in the chaotic, bloody aftermath of Alexander's death. The massive Greek Empire had shattered, and the surviving generals were tearing each other to pieces to claim the scraps. Pyrrhus was born right into the middle of this meat grinder. He was a king from the rugged, mountainous fringes of the Greek world, a man who possessed absolute tactical genius, terrifying personal bravery, and a fatal inability to just sit still. But Pyrrhus is famous for one reason above all others. He was the very first international superpower to recognize the rising threat of a small, aggressive republic in central Italy called Rome. Before the Roman Empire dominated the globe, before Julius Caesar, and before the Colosseum, Rome was just a tough, rapidly expanding city-state. Pyrrhus was the man who crossed the sea to stop them. He brought the absolute pinnacle of ancient warfare to the shores of Italy. The unstoppable, bristling wall of the Greek pike phalanx, and a terrifying weapon the Romans had never even seen before, the war elephant. The ensuing clash between Pyrrhus and the Roman Republic was a collision of two completely different military philosophies. It was a war so unimaginably brutal, and so staggeringly costly, that it permanently etched Pyrrhus's name into our language. But before he was the boogeyman of the Roman Senate, and before he commanded thousands of men and beasts, Pyrrhus was just a boy born into absolute political chaos. To understand how he eventually found himself staring down the Roman legions, we have to go back to the very beginning. We have to travel to the wild, stormy mountains of Epirus, where a violent coup d'état was about to turn a 2-year-old toddler into a hunted fugitive. The year was 316 BCE. Pyrrhus was just 2 years old, an infant prince in the mountainous kingdom of Epirus. But his royal blood was not a shield, it was a target. His father, King Aeacides, had made a fatal political miscalculation. He had taken his army out of the country to fight in the massive, bloody civil wars that were tearing the Greek world apart. While the king was away, a faction of his own people rebelled. They seized the capital, allied themselves with the ruthless King Cassander of Macedon, and declared a violent purge of the royal family. Assassins immediately began hunting down the king's supporters, and their primary target was the 2-year-old heir to the throne. But Pyrrhus was surrounded by fiercely loyal retainers. Before the assassins could reach the royal nursery, a group of guards scooped up the toddler, grabbed his wet nurses, and fled into the pitch-black mountains. What followed was one of the most cinematic escapes in ancient history. The fugitives were traveling on foot, carrying a screaming toddler through treacherous mountain passes, with a posse of assassins closing in right behind them. They sprinted toward the northern border, desperate to reach the neighboring kingdom of Illyria, where they hoped to find sanctuary. But just as they were about to cross the border, disaster struck. They reached the banks of a river, only to find that heavy rains had turned it into a raging, impassable torrent. The water was too deep and fast to wade across, and they had no boats. To make matters worse, night was falling, and they could hear their pursuers drawing closer. Through the gloom, the guards saw a small village on the opposite bank of the river. They screamed for help, trying to get the villagers to bring a boat across. But the roar of the rapids was so deafening that the villagers couldn't hear a single word. Running out of time, one of the guards had a brilliant, desperate idea. He stripped off a piece of tree bark, took out his dagger, and quickly carved a message into the wood, explaining who the boy was and begging for salvation. He then tied the bark to a heavy stone, or perhaps the shaft of a javelin, and hurled it with all his might across the roaring river. The villagers found the message, realized a royal prince was about to be murdered on their doorstep, and immediately leaped into action. They chopped down trees in the dark, lashed them together to form a crude raft, and pushed it across the freezing rapids. The loyal guards placed the 2-year-old Pyrrhus and his nurses onto the raft and ferried them to safety, just moments before the assassins arrived on the river bank. The altar of the Illyrian king. The fugitives had survived the night, but their ordeal was far from over. They marched to the court of King Glaucius, the ruler of a powerful Illyrian tribe known as the Talantii. When the exhausted, terrified retainers entered the great hall, King Glaucius was sitting on his throne, deep in thought. The situation was incredibly dangerous. By taking in this fugitive child, Glaucius would be officially declaring war on the rebels in Epirus and, more importantly, provoking the wrath of Cassander, the most powerful and ruthless warlord in Greece. The king sat in absolute silence, weighing the massive political risks of harboring this boy. The retainers laid the 2-year-old Pyrrhus gently on the floor at the king's feet, silently begging for his protection. What happened next became a legend. As the king stared down at him, the toddler simply crawled forward. Little Pyrrhus grabbed the edge of the king's heavy robes, pulled himself up to a standing position, and rested his hands directly on the king's knees. Some ancient sources say he crawled over to the sacred altar of the hearth gods and pulled himself up there, wrapping his tiny arms around the altar stones. Whatever the exact movement was, the effect was profound. King Glaucius looked down at this bold, fearless little boy who seemed to be demanding his protection from the gods themselves, and his heart completely melted. He scooped the boy up into his arms, turned to the nervous retainers, and declared that Pyrrhus would be raised alongside his own sons. Cassander of Macedon soon sent ambassadors to Illyria, offering King Glaucius a massive fortune in silver if he would simply hand the child over to be executed. Glaucius flatly refused. And so, Pyrrhus spent his formative years not in the soft luxury of a royal palace, but in the rugged, warrior culture of the Illyrian tribes. He was raised on horseback, taught to fight with sword and javelin, and hardened by the bitter mountain winters. He was being forged into a weapon. And as he grew from a toddler into a fiercely strong young man, he had only one goal in mind: to march back across those mountains and violently reclaim the throne that had been stolen from him. King Glaucius's heart had been won, but his mind quickly recognized the opportunity that little Pyrrhus represented. For the next decade, while Pyrrhus grew up in the rugged Illyrian hill forts, Glaucius watched Epirus and Macedon like a hawk. When Pyrrhus was just 12 years old, the opportunity arrived. The anti-Molossian faction in Epirus was fracturing, and King Cassander of Macedon, the great enemy of Pyrrhus's family, was distracted by other massive wars. King Glaucias didn't hesitate. He assembled his formidable Illyrian army, put the 12-year-old Pyrrhus on a horse at the front of the column, and marched across the mountains into Epirus. The invasion was a lightning strike. The local tribes, many of whom still remembered the old royal family, flocked to Pyrrhus's banner, and the pro-Macedonian rebels were quickly crushed. The boy who had fled in the dead of night as a hunted fugitive now entered his capital in triumph. He was officially declared King Pyrrhus of Epirus, and the world saw a major tactical peace return to the board. For 4 years, he ruled the mountain kingdom as a teenage warrior king, personally leading his troops to suppress lingering rebellions and forge a new royal court. But in the chaotic world of the Diadochi, the successors of Alexander the Great, stability was an illusion. In 302 BCE, when Pyrrhus was just 16, he left Epirus to attend the wedding of a minor Illyrian prince, believing his kingdom was secure. This was a fatal mistake. The moment his back was turned, a new faction of Molossians, backed by a rival king, launched a bloodless coup and seized control of the government. When Pyrrhus rode back to the border, he found his kingdom locked tight, and his allies scattered. He was 16 years old, an exile for the second time, and completely penniless. Most young men would have simply dissolved into obscurity, but Pyrrhus possessed a fatal inability to admit defeat. With nowhere else to go, he traveled eastward to find one of the only men left on earth who might help him. He sought out the legendary warlord Demetrius I of Macedon, the man history remembers as Demetrius Poliorcetes, the besieger of cities. Demetrius was an international celebrity, a tactical genius who had conquered empires and was now building his own colossal superstate. Pyrrhus entered the service of Demetrius as a junior cavalry officer, hoping to trade his sword for an army to reclaim Epirus. He was quickly swept up into the grand, catastrophic scale of the Diadocha Wars. He found himself marching at the front of a massive army that was preparing for a clash so colossal it would decide the fate of the ancient world. They were marching to the dusty plains of central Turkey, where the lines were already being drawn for the single greatest military engagement in all of Greek history, the Battle of Ipsus. The year was 301 BCE, and the 16-year-old Pyrrhus found himself standing on the dusty plains of Phrygia, in central Turkey. This was the Battle of Ipsus, widely known as the Battle of the Kings. It was the absolute climax of the wars that followed the death of Alexander the Great. To understand the sheer scale of this battle, you have to throw out everything you know about normal ancient warfare. This was not a border skirmish between two cities. This was a world war. Over 160,000 men were packed onto the plain. The air was thick with the dust of thousands of heavy cavalry horses, and the ground literally shook beneath the feet of nearly 500 war elephants. Pyrrhus was fighting under the banner of Demetrius the besieger and his father, the terrifying, one-eyed warlord Antigonus. Lined up against them was a massive coalition of the other successor kings, men who had marched all the way from Greece, Egypt, and Babylon just to crush Antigonus and divide his empire. When the battle lines finally clashed, it was absolute, deafening carnage. Despite his young age, Pyrrhus was given command of a cavalry detachment. Ancient historians explicitly note that in the absolute chaos of this titanic battle, the teenage king of Epirus fought like a demon. He charged directly into the enemy lines, cutting down seasoned veterans and proving to the entire ancient world that he possessed a terrifying, almost supernatural talent for violence. But individual brilliance could not save the day. Pyrrhus's commander, Demetrius, made a catastrophic tactical error. Demetrius led a massive cavalry charge that successfully shattered the enemy wing, but he chased the fleeing soldiers far too deep into the dust. Before Demetrius could turn his horses around, the enemy general Seleucus quickly marched a massive wall of 300 war elephants directly into the gap, completely cutting Demetrius off from the rest of his army. With Demetrius trapped behind a wall of elephants, the coalition forces surrounded his 81-year-old father, Antigonus. The old warlord was completely buried under a hail of javelins. The battle was lost. Pyrrhus and Demetrius barely managed to fight their way out of the slaughter, fleeing into the night with only a tiny fraction of their army. The defeat at Ipsus was a total disaster for Pyrrhus. He was once again a king without a kingdom, serving as a junior officer for a defeated warlord. For the next 2 years, he traveled across the Aegean Sea with Demetrius, putting down rebellions and trying to salvage the wreckage of their empire. Eventually, Demetrius realized he needed a truce to rebuild his strength. He reached out to Ptolemy I, the Greek general who had taken over Egypt and declared himself pharaoh. Ptolemy agreed to a peace treaty, but he demanded a guarantee. He demanded that Demetrius send a high-ranking political hostage to live in Alexandria, to ensure Demetrius wouldn't break the peace. Demetrius looked at his young, ferocious cavalry commander. Pyrrhus was a king, he had royal blood, and he was the perfect collateral. And so, the exiled teenage warlord was loaded onto a ship and sent across the Mediterranean to the court of the Egyptian pharaoh. When Pyrrhus arrived in Alexandria, he stepped into a world completely alien to the rugged, freezing mountains of his youth. Alexandria was the wealthiest, most luxurious, and most culturally advanced city on the face of the earth. But Pyrrhus did not act like a defeated hostage, and he refused to fade into the background of the royal court. He immediately recognized that Ptolemy's court was a massive political chessboard, and he decided to play the game. Instead of drinking and partying with the other young aristocrats, Pyrrhus dedicated himself completely to physical perfection and royal etiquette. He participated in the royal hunts, proving himself to be incredibly brave and skilled with a javelin. He was charming, respectful to his elders, and, most importantly, he figured out exactly who really held the power in Egypt. It was not just Ptolemy. The true power behind the throne was Ptolemy's fiercely intelligent and influential wife, Queen Berenice. Pyrrhus went out of his way to impress her, showering her with respect and demonstrating that he was not just a brute, but a highly sophisticated prince. Queen Berenice was absolutely captivated by this intense, brilliant young exile. She decided that Pyrrhus was far too valuable to simply keep as a prisoner. She had a daughter from a previous marriage, a young princess named Antigone. In a stunning reversal of fortune, the queen orchestrated a royal marriage between the hostage and her own daughter. Overnight, Pyrrhus transformed from a political prisoner into the beloved son-in-law of the Egyptian pharaoh. With Queen Berenice's backing, the Egyptian treasury was suddenly thrown wide open to him. Ptolemy provided Pyrrhus with a massive fleet of ships, a mountain of gold, and a hardened army of mercenaries. He was 22 years old. His exile was officially over. Pyrrhus boarded his new Egyptian fleet, looked toward the northern horizon, and set sail to take his mountains back by force. When the Egyptian fleet finally dropped anchor on the rocky shores of Epirus, Pyrrhus did not arrive as a desperate beggar. He marched down the gangplank with chests full of Ptolemy's gold and a highly disciplined army of mercenaries at his back. The political landscape of his homeland had shifted once again during his absence. The man currently sitting on the throne was his cousin, Neoptolemus, the very same man who had orchestrated the bloodless coup that drove Pyrrhus into exile 6 years earlier. But Neoptolemus was weak, paranoid, and rapidly losing the support of the Epirot nobility. When the people of Epirus saw Pyrrhus return, now a wealthy, hardened veteran of the great Eastern wars with the backing of the Egyptian pharaoh, they flocked to him by the thousands. Realizing that his own army would likely defect if a battle took place, Neoptolemus sent desperate messengers to Pyrrhus's camp, begging for a truce. Pyrrhus was a brilliant tactician, but he was also a pragmatist. A violent civil war would drain the very resources he needed to build his empire. So, he agreed to a bizarre and highly unstable political compromise. Pyrrhus and Neoptolemus would share the crown. They would rule Epirus together as co-kings. For a brief period, the arrangement seemed to work, but it was essentially a political powder keg waiting for a spark. Epirus was a small, rugged kingdom, and it was simply not big enough for two ambitious warlords. The royal court quickly split into two fiercely loyal, heavily armed factions that constantly plotted against one another in the shadows. The breaking point arrived during the kingdom's most sacred religious holiday. Every year, the kings of Epirus and the tribal nobility gathered at the ancient capital of Parsaran to offer sacrifices to Zeus and exchange ceremonial gifts. It was a massive, days-long festival fueled by excessive drinking and political posturing. During one of the royal banquets, a wealthy supporter of Neoptolemus named Gelon approached Pyrrhus and gifted him 2 magnificent, highly trained plough oxen. One of Pyrrhus's closest friends, a man named Myrtilus, who also served as the king's royal cupbearer, loudly asked Pyrrhus to give the oxen to him instead. When Pyrrhus refused, Myrtilus stormed out of the banquet hall, deeply insulted. Seeing an opportunity to exploit this sudden rift, Gelon followed the cupbearer out into the dark. He invited Myrtilus to his tent, poured him more wine, and made a terrifying proposition. He told the cupbearer that Neoptolemus was ready to take sole control of the kingdom. All Myrtilus had to do was slip a vial of poison into Pyrrhus's wine cup, and he would be rewarded with more wealth than he could ever imagine. But Gelon had severely misjudged the loyalty of Pyrrhus's inner circle. The moment the meeting was over, Myrtilus ran straight to Pyrrhus and confessed the entire plot. Pyrrhus realized that Neoptolemus was making his move, but he needed undeniable proof before he could strike a killing blow without sparking a civil war. He instructed his cupbearer to pretend to go along with the assassination, but to recruit a second servant into the conspiracy to act as a witness. The plotters grew sloppy in their confidence. The ancient historian Plutarch records a brilliantly tense scene where Neoptolemus and his loyalists were discussing the details of the assassination in a private room, entirely unaware that a female servant was hiding quietly in the corner, concealed behind a massive pile of heavy ox hides. She listened to every word, memorized the names of the conspirators, and immediately smuggled the information back to Pyrrhus. With the evidence he needed, Pyrrhus decided to strike first. He did not order a public execution or send assassins in the dark. Instead, he invited Neoptolemus to a private, sacred banquet, a dinner supposedly meant to strengthen their political alliance. As the two kings sat down to eat, Pyrrhus and his guards drew their daggers and slaughtered Neoptolemus right there in the dining hall. Pyrrhus immediately stepped outside, addressed the shocked nobility, and presented the evidence of the poison plot. Because Neoptolemus was deeply unpopular, and because Pyrrhus had the unquestioned loyalty of the military, the people of Epirus accepted the assassination as legitimate self-defense. At the age of 23, Pyrrhus was finally the sole, undisputed king of Epirus. He no longer had to share his throne, and he immediately set to work transforming his backwater mountain kingdom into a terrifying military superpower. He used the remaining Egyptian gold to import cutting-edge Hellenistic military technology. He standardized his infantry, equipping them with the massive, 18-foot-long sarissa pikes used by Alexander the Great, forming them into an impenetrable phalanx. He aggressively reformed the cavalry, training them to charge in the devastating wedge formation. But Pyrrhus knew that to compete with the massive empires of the East, he needed to expand his borders, and he used his royal status to do it without spilling a drop of blood. He engaged in a brilliant campaign of strategic polygamy. He married several princesses from neighboring kingdoms, securing absolute alliances with the fierce Illyrian tribes to the north and the Paeonians to the east. His most brilliant political marriage, however, was to a woman named Lanassa. She was the daughter of Agathocles, the incredibly wealthy and ruthless Greek tyrant of Syracuse, a massive city on the island of Sicily. As her dowry, Agathocles gifted Pyrrhus the strategic island of Corcyra, known today as Corfu. This single island gave Pyrrhus a massive, deep-water naval base and total control over the shipping lanes between Greece and Italy. In just a few short years, Pyrrhus had completely rewritten the balance of power in the Mediterranean. He was no longer a hunted fugitive or a political pawn. He was a wealthy, highly experienced warlord commanding a fanatically loyal army, and he was surrounded by weak, collapsing kingdoms. He sat on his throne in Epirus, looked across the borders, and began to plan his next war. Pyrrhus was sitting on his newly secured throne, looking across his borders for a war, and he did not have to wait long. The opportunity came from the absolute last place anyone expected, the kingdom of Macedon, the very empire that had hunted him when he was a toddler. King Cassander, the ruthless warlord who had ordered the infant Pyrrhus to be executed, had finally died of a gruesome wasting disease. Almost immediately, Cassander's two sons plunged the kingdom into a vicious civil war over the crown. The younger son, a prince named Alexander, was losing badly. Desperate to survive, Alexander sent panicked messengers to Epirus, begging Pyrrhus to march an army across the mountains and save him. Pyrrhus agreed to help, but his price was absolute extortion. He told the desperate prince that he would save his life, but in exchange, Epirus would annex massive chunks of Macedonia's western provinces. With no other choice, Alexander agreed. Pyrrhus marched his newly reformed, highly disciplined phalanxes across the border, effortlessly crushed the rival brothers' forces, and placed Alexander securely on the throne. It was incredibly easy, and Pyrrhus had just doubled the size of his kingdom without fighting a major battle. But there was a massive, unforeseen complication. In his sheer panic, Prince Alexander had actually sent out 2 letters begging for help. The first went to Pyrrhus. The second went to the most dangerous man in the Mediterranean, Demetrius the Besieger, Pyrrhus's old mentor and former commander from the colossal Battle of Ipsus. Demetrius arrived in Macedon with his army entirely too late. Pyrrhus had already solved the problem. Prince Alexander went out to meet Demetrius, thanked him profusely for making the trip, and politely asked him to go home. But Demetrius was not the kind of man you politely dismiss. During a supposedly friendly royal banquet a few days later, Demetrius had the young prince assassinated, walked out of the dining hall, and simply declared himself the new king of Macedon. Suddenly, Pyrrhus and his old mentor were sharing a border. For a brief moment, they tried to maintain a fragile peace, remembering their days fighting side by side. But that peace was completely obliterated when Pyrrhus's personal life violently imploded. Pyrrhus's primary wife, Lanassa, the wealthy princess from Syracuse who had gifted him the incredibly strategic island of Corcyra, grew absolutely furious with him. As part of his political strategy, Pyrrhus had taken several other wives from neighboring barbarian tribes, and Lanassa felt deeply insulted by the attention he gave them. She decided she had had enough. She packed her bags, sailed back to the island of Corcyra, and sent a letter to Demetrius. She offered the besieger the island, its massive naval base, and her hand in marriage, just to spite her husband. Demetrius, never one to turn down free real estate and a chance to wound a rival, gladly accepted. It was the ultimate betrayal, and it meant total war. Pyrrhus marched his army deep into Macedonian territory to confront his former commander. What happened next permanently cemented Pyrrhus's reputation as a living legend. During a massive clash between the two armies, Demetrius's top general, a giant of a man named Pantorchus, widely considered the deadliest warrior in Macedon, stepped out ahead of his lines. In front of tens of thousands of screaming soldiers, Pantorchus openly challenged Pyrrhus to single combat. This was exactly the kind of theatrical, terrifying violence that Pyrrhus lived for. He immediately rode to the front of his army, dismounted, and charged the giant. The two men crashed into each other with spears and heavy bronze shields. It was a brutal, bloody duel. Pantorchus managed to drive his spear point directly into Pyrrhus's leg, drawing first blood. But Pyrrhus didn't even flinch. He absorbed the blow, closed the distance, and struck Pantorchus twice with terrifying speed, once in the neck and once deep in the thigh. The giant collapsed into the dirt, and Pyrrhus's bodyguards had to physically drag the wounded king back to their lines as the Epirote army roared in triumph and charged. The psychological effect of this single duel was absolutely staggering. The Macedonian soldiers, watching from the other side of the battlefield, were not angry at Pyrrhus, they were mesmerized. They had grown deeply sick of Demetrius, who had become an arrogant, theatrical tyrant, wearing robes of purple and gold and refusing to listen to his own men. In Pyrrhus, covered in blood and fighting violently at the very front of the line, the Macedonian veterans saw a ghost. They saw the literal reincarnation of Alexander the Great. They began whispering that while other kings only dressed like Alexander, Pyrrhus fought like him. They gave him a new nickname right there on the battlefield. They called him the Eagle. In a stunning turn of events, massive chunks of the Macedonian military simply dropped their weapons, walked across the battlefield, and defected to Pyrrhus. Without fighting a major siege, Pyrrhus marched into the capital and was crowned king of Macedon, adding the most legendary military state in Greece to his growing empire. But ruling an empire is much harder than conquering one. The political winds of the Greek world were constantly shifting. After holding the throne of Macedon for barely 7 months, a massive coalition of other warlords combined their forces to push him out. Realizing he was vastly outnumbered and not wanting to waste the lives of his loyal Epirote veterans in a defensive meat grinder, Pyrrhus simply shrugged, packed up his army, and marched back home to his mountains. And so, as the year 281 BCE approached, Pyrrhus found himself back exactly where he had started. He was incredibly wealthy, his army was battle-hardened and utterly devoted to him, and he was universally recognized as the greatest tactical mind of his generation. But as he sat in his palace in Epirus, he was entirely, suffocatingly bored. He was a weapon without a target. He paced the halls of his palace, complaining to his advisers that peace was going to make him soft. He was desperately waiting for a war, and the gods were about to deliver him a masterpiece. A ship arrived in his harbor carrying a delegation of panicked, wealthy diplomats from across the sea. They were from the Greek colony of Tarentum, located on the southern coast of Italy. They had sailed across the Ionian Sea bearing a massive amount of gold and a desperate plea for salvation. They told Pyrrhus that they had accidentally started a war with a terrifying new enemy, a brutal republic of citizen soldiers who fought like nothing the Greeks had ever seen. They begged the eagle to cross the sea and save them from the rising power of Rome. Pyrrhus was sitting on his newly secured throne, looking across his borders for a war, and he did not have to wait long. The opportunity came from the absolute last place anyone expected, the kingdom of Macedon, the very empire that had hunted him when he was a toddler. King Cassander, the ruthless warlord who had ordered the infant Pyrrhus to be executed, had finally died of a gruesome wasting disease. Almost immediately, Cassander's two sons plunged the kingdom into a vicious civil war over the crown. The younger son, a prince named Alexander, was losing badly. Desperate to survive, Alexander sent panicked messengers to Epirus, begging Pyrrhus to march an army across the mountains and save him. Pyrrhus agreed to help, but his price was absolute extortion. He told the desperate prince that he would save his life, but in exchange, Epirus would annex massive chunks of Macedonia's western provinces. With no other choice, Alexander agreed. Pyrrhus marched his newly reformed, highly disciplined phalanxes across the border, effortlessly crushed the rival brothers' forces, and placed Alexander securely on the throne. It was incredibly easy, and Pyrrhus had just doubled the size of his kingdom without fighting a major battle. But there was a massive, unforeseen complication. In his sheer panic, Prince Alexander had actually sent out 2 letters begging for help. The first went to Pyrrhus. The second went to the most dangerous man in the Mediterranean, Demetrius the Besieger, Pyrrhus's old mentor and former commander from the colossal Battle of Ipsus. Demetrius arrived in Macedon with his army entirely too late. Pyrrhus had already solved the problem. Prince Alexander went out to meet Demetrius, thanked him profusely for making the trip, and politely asked him to go home. But Demetrius was not the kind of man you politely dismiss. During a supposedly friendly royal banquet a few days later, Demetrius had the young prince assassinated, walked out of the dining hall, and simply declared himself the new king of Macedon. Suddenly, Pyrrhus and his old mentor were sharing a border. For a brief moment, they tried to maintain a fragile peace, remembering their days fighting side by side. But that peace was completely obliterated when Pyrrhus's personal life violently imploded. Pyrrhus's primary wife, Lanassa, the wealthy princess from Syracuse who had gifted him the incredibly strategic island of Corcyra, grew absolutely furious with him. As part of his political strategy, Pyrrhus had taken several other wives from neighboring barbarian tribes, and Lanassa felt deeply insulted by the attention he gave them. She decided she had had enough. She packed her bags, sailed back to the island of Corcyra, and sent a letter to Demetrius. She offered the besieger the island, its massive naval base, and her hand in marriage, just to spite her husband. Demetrius, never one to turn down free real estate and a chance to wound a rival, gladly accepted. It was the ultimate betrayal, and it meant total war. Pyrrhus marched his army deep into Macedonian territory to confront his former commander. What happened next permanently cemented Pyrrhus's reputation as a living legend. During a massive clash between the two armies, Demetrius's top general, a giant of a man named Pyrrhus, widely considered the deadliest warrior in Macedon, stepped out ahead of his lines. In front of tens of thousands of screaming soldiers, Pyrrhus openly challenged Pyrrhus to single combat. This was exactly the kind of theatrical, terrifying violence that Pyrrhus lived for. He immediately rode to the front of his army, dismounted, and charged the giant. The two men crashed into each other with spears and heavy bronze shields. It was a brutal, bloody duel. Pyrrhus managed to drive his spear point directly into Pyrrhus's leg, drawing first blood. But Pyrrhus didn't even flinch. He absorbed the blow, closed the distance, and struck Pyrrhus twice with terrifying speed, once in the neck and once deep in the thigh. The giant collapsed into the dirt, and Pyrrhus's bodyguards had to physically drag the wounded king back to their lines as the Epirot army roared in triumph and charged. The psychological effect of this single duel was absolutely staggering. The Macedonian soldiers, watching from the other side of the battlefield, were not angry at Pyrrhus, they were mesmerized. They had grown deeply sick of Demetrius, who had become an arrogant, theatrical tyrant, wearing robes of purple and gold and refusing to listen to his own men. In Pyrrhus, covered in blood and fighting violently at the very front of the line, the Macedonian veterans saw a ghost. They saw the literal reincarnation of Alexander the Great. They began whispering that while other kings only dressed like Alexander, Pyrrhus fought like him. They gave him a new nickname right there on the battlefield. They called him the Eagle. In a stunning turn of events, massive chunks of the Macedonian military simply dropped their weapons, walked across the battlefield, and defected to Pyrrhus. Without fighting a major siege, Pyrrhus marched into the capital and was crowned king of Macedon, adding the most legendary military state in Greece to his growing empire. But ruling an empire is much harder than conquering one. The political winds of the Greek world were constantly shifting. After holding the throne of Macedon for barely 7 months, a massive coalition of other warlords combined their forces to push him out. Realizing he was vastly outnumbered and not wanting to waste the lives of his loyal Epirot veterans in a defensive meat grinder, Pyrrhus simply shrugged, packed up his army, and marched back home to his mountains. And so, as the year 281 BCE approached, Pyrrhus found himself back exactly where he had started. He was incredibly wealthy, his army was battle-hardened and utterly devoted to him, and he was universally recognized as the greatest tactical mind of his generation. But as he sat in his palace in Epirus, he was entirely, suffocatingly bored. He was a weapon without a target. He paced the halls of his palace, complaining to his advisers that peace was going to make him soft. He was desperately waiting for a war, and the gods were about to deliver him a masterpiece. A ship arrived in his harbor carrying a delegation of panicked, wealthy diplomats from across the sea. They were from the Greek colony of Tarentum, located on the southern coast of Italy. They had sailed across the Ionian Sea bearing a massive amount of gold and a desperate plea for salvation. They told Pyrrhus that they had accidentally started a war with a terrifying new enemy, a brutal republic of citizen soldiers who fought like nothing the Greeks had ever seen. They begged the Eagle to cross the sea and save them from the rising power of Rome. The diplomats standing in Pyrrhus's throne room were from Tarentum, the wealthiest and most powerful Greek colony in southern Italy. They had built their fortune on trade and a massive navy, but they had grown accustomed to hiring other people to fight their wars. For years, they had watched with growing anxiety as the Roman Republic steadily devoured the tribes and cities of central Italy, inching closer and closer to their own borders. The spark that finally ignited the powder keg was almost absurd. By an ancient treaty, Roman warships were strictly forbidden from sailing into the Gulf of Tarentum. But one afternoon, a small squadron of Roman ships, perhaps blown off course or perhaps intentionally testing the waters, sailed directly into the Gulf while the people of Tarentum were sitting in their massive outdoor theatre. Seeing the Roman ships as a blatant act of aggression, the Tarentines flew into a rage, launched their own massive warships, and sank the Roman fleet, killing the admiral. When Rome sent diplomats to demand an apology and reparations, the Tarentines didn't just refuse, they humiliated them. A local man actually mocked the Roman ambassador's toga and threw dirt on him in the street. The Roman ambassador reportedly held up his stained toga and declared that the dirt would be washed away with a river of Tarentine blood. Rome immediately declared war, and the terrified Tarentines, realizing they had just picked a fight with a wood chipper, panicked and ran to the greatest warlord in the Greek world to save them. Pyrrhus listened to the diplomats promise him a massive coalition of Italian tribes and tens of thousands of local troops if he would just cross the sea and lead them. He was absolutely thrilled. This was the massive, glorious war he had been waiting for. But not everyone in his court was excited. Pyrrhus had a chief minister named Cineas, a man who had studied under the great orator Demosthenes. Cineas was a brilliant diplomat, and he was the only man in Epirus who had the courage to tell the king when he was making a mistake. What followed between them is one of the most famous conversations in ancient history, a philosophical masterclass perfectly illustrating Pyrrhus's fatal flaw. Cineas found Pyrrhus finalizing his invasion plans and casually asked him, "Sir, the Romans are rumored to be excellent soldiers. If the gods grant us victory over them, what will we do next?" Pyrrhus smiled and replied that once Rome fell, the rest of Italy would easily surrender, and he would be the master of the entire peninsula. Cineas nodded and asked, "And after we conquer Italy, what then?" Pyrrhus pointed to a map. "Sicily is right next door. It's wealthy, divided, and ripe for the taking. We will conquer Sicily." "And after Sicily?" Cineas pressed. "Well," Pyrrhus said, his eyes gleaming with ambition, "from Sicily, it's just a short sail to Africa. We will invade Carthage and conquer the Libyans." Cineas paused, letting the sheer scale of this endless violence hang in the air. "And once we have conquered Italy, Sicily, and Carthage, and destroyed all our enemies, what will we do then, my king?" Pyrrhus laughed, clapped his friend on the shoulder, and said, "Then, my friend, we will finally be able to sit back, drink wine, and enjoy a life of peace and conversation." Cineas looked directly at his king and delivered the killing blow. "Sir, we already have wine. We already have peace. We can sit and converse right now. Why must we cross oceans of blood to get something that you already have in your hands?" It was a brilliant, airtight argument. But Pyrrhus was a creature of war, he simply could not hear it. He ignored Cineas's warning and ordered the full mobilization of the Epirote military machine. Pyrrhus was not taking any chances against this mysterious Roman Republic. He assembled a terrifyingly perfect Hellenistic army. He loaded 20,000 heavy infantry wielding the 18-foot Sarissa pikes onto transport ships. He brought 3,000 elite Thessalian cavalry, 2,000 archers, and 500 Rhodian slingers. But his ultimate trump card was something the Romans had never laid eyes on. Pyrrhus had secured 20 massive Indian war elephants, loaned to him by his royal allies back in Egypt and Macedon. In the spring of 280 BCE, the massive armada set sail across the Ionian Sea toward Italy. But the gods, it seemed, agreed with Cineas. Halfway across the water, a catastrophic, unseasonal hurricane slammed into the fleet. The wooden transport ships were scattered, smashed against each other, and driven completely off course. Pyrrhus's own royal flagship was caught in the worst of the storm. The wind ripped the sails to shreds, and the ship was taking on water fast. Refusing to drown in the dark, Pyrrhus actually dove off the sinking ship into the freezing, violent waves. He swam through the hurricane for hours, fighting the current with sheer, terrifying physical endurance until he finally washed up on the Italian coastline, half dead, completely exhausted, and surrounded by the wreckage of his armada. Over the next few days, the surviving ships limped into the harbor of Tarentum. Pyrrhus had lost thousands of men to the sea, and some of his precious elephants had drowned. But the Eagle had landed in Italy. He quickly marched into the city of Tarentum and realized immediately that the diplomats had completely lied to him. There was no massive coalition army waiting for him. The local Tarentines were lounging in their public baths and hosting dinner parties, expecting the legendary Greek warlord to go fight the Romans while they stayed home and relaxed. Pyrrhus was furious. He immediately declared martial law. He shut down the theaters, locked the public baths, cancelled all the festivals, and drafted the soft, complaining citizens of Tarentum into his phalanxes, forcing them to drill under the brutal discipline of his epirote officers. He had to get them ready fast. Word had just arrived from the north. The Roman consul, Publius Valerius Levinus, was not waiting for the Greeks to organize. He had mobilized a massive consular army of over 30,000 hardened legionaries, and they were marching rapidly south, directly toward Pyrrhus, eager to push this arrogant foreign king right back into the sea. Pyrrhus knew that his newly drafted Tarentine soldiers were entirely unready for a pitched battle against hardened veterans, so his first move was a desperate attempt to buy time. He sent a letter to the Roman consul, Valerius Levinus, offering to act as a neutral judge to mediate the dispute between Rome and Tarentum without any further bloodshed. Levinus sent back a terrifyingly blunt reply. He told Pyrrhus that Rome neither accepted him as a judge, nor feared him as an enemy. He advised the Greek king to pack up his toys and go back across the sea before the legions crushed him. Realizing that diplomacy was dead, Pyrrhus marched his army out of the city walls and headed north to meet the Romans. He chose his ground carefully, setting up his camp near the city of Heraclea, just behind the banks of the Ceres River. He planned to use the river as a natural barrier, forcing the Romans to cross the water and fight uphill against his heavy infantry. He even rode down to the river bank himself to inspect the Roman camp on the other side. When he saw the perfect, geometric, hyper-organized layout of the Roman tents, he turned to one of his officers and muttered that these barbarians did not seem very barbaric at all. He was absolutely right. The battle that followed was the first time in human history that the unstoppable Greek phalanx collided with the flexible Roman legion, and it was an absolute meat grinder. The Romans didn't wait for Pyrrhus to organize his defenses. Levinus aggressively ordered his infantry to ford the river. To cover their crossing, he sent his cavalry upstream to outflank the Greek positions. Seeing the Romans surging across the water, Pyrrhus did what he always did. He didn't sit safely in the back to manage the battle. He strapped on a magnificent, highly decorated helmet, grabbed a spear, and personally led a massive cavalry charge directly into the Roman lines to stall them. The ensuing cavalry battle was wildly chaotic. Because of his flashy armor, Pyrrhus was a massive, shining target. A Roman cavalry officer locked eyes with him across the battlefield, charged his horse through the melee, and drove his spear directly into Pyrrhus's horse, bringing the king crashing to the ground. His bodyguards barely managed to drag him out of the crush of swords and hooves. Realizing that his glittering armor was going to get him killed, Pyrrhus literally stripped off his royal cloak and helmet right there in the mud and traded armor with his closest bodyguard, a man named Megacles. Pyrrhus ran back to his infantry lines in disguise, while Megacles rode back into the cavalry fight wearing the king's armor. Tragically, the disguise worked too well. The Romans aggressively hunted Megacles down, killed him, and paraded the stolen royal helmet around the battlefield, screaming that the Greek king was dead. The Epirot army began to panic, and the line was on the verge of entirely collapsing. Pyrrhus had to rip off his generic helmet, ride up and down his own lines with his face completely exposed, and scream at his men that he was still alive. With the panic subdued, the massive infantry lines finally crashed together. This was the ultimate test of military technology. The Greeks had a solid wall of overlapping bronze shields, bristling with thousands of 18-foot-long iron-tipped pikes. The Romans were fighting with short swords and large, curved shields, using a highly flexible system that allowed fresh soldiers to constantly cycle to the front. According to ancient historians, the two massive armies pushed each other back and forth 7 different times. It was a brutal, agonizing stalemate. The Romans couldn't hack their way through the terrifying wall of pikes, but the Greeks couldn't push forward without their rigid formation breaking apart on the uneven, bloody ground. The casualties on both sides were absolutely staggering. Seeing that his infantry was exhausting itself against an unbreakable enemy, Pyrrhus realized it was time to play his trump card. He gave the signal, and from the rear of the Epirot camp, his secret weapon was unleashed. 20 massive Indian war elephants, towering over the battlefield and carrying towers filled with archers on their backs, charged the Roman lines. The Romans were completely paralyzed by shock. They had never even seen an elephant before. The soldiers panicked and started calling them Lucanian cows. But the real devastation was to the Roman cavalry. Horses are deeply terrified by the smell and sound of elephants. Before the Roman riders could even issue an order, their horses panicked, bucked their riders into the mud, and fled the battlefield in absolute terror. Without their cavalry to protect their flanks, the Roman infantry line was completely exposed. The elephants crashed into the legions, physically trampling the heavy infantry and shattering their formations. Seeing the Romans finally break, Pyrrhus ordered his elite Thessalian cavalry to charge the gaps. The Roman army shattered and fled. Pyrrhus had won the Battle of Heraclea. But as he walked the battlefield that evening, the reality of what it meant to fight Rome began to sink in. He looked down at the thousands of dead Roman soldiers and realized a terrifying fact. Every single one of them had died with their wounds on the front of their bodies. Not a single Roman had been stabbed in the back while running away. They had all stood their ground and died facing the pikes. Pyrrhus famously looked at the carnage and whispered that if he had soldiers like the Romans, or if he were their king, he would easily conquer the entire world. He had won the day, but he had lost thousands of his absolute best, irreplaceable Epirot veterans. And worst of all, the Romans didn't surrender. They just retreated a few miles, dug a new camp, and started raising a brand new army. And so, as the dust settles over the bloody banks of the Ceres River and the screams of the elephants finally fade into the Italian night, we leave Pyrrhus of Epirus standing at the absolute peak of his power, yet staring directly into an abyss. Let us take a moment to look at exactly how far this man has come, and how completely he has shattered the political landscape of the ancient world. The eagle is 39 years old. He began his life as a terrified, 2-year-old fugitive being smuggled through the mountains in the dead of night. He survived the brutal court politics of Illyria, he survived the apocalyptic carnage of the Battle of Ipsus, and he navigated the deadly, gilded cages of the Egyptian pharaohs. He clawed his way back to his mountain throne, assassinated his rivals, and briefly crowned himself king of Macedon. By crossing the Ionian Sea to answer the call of Tarentum, Pyrrhus has done something no one else had dared to do. He has brought the absolute pinnacle of Eastern military technology, the unstoppable Macedonian pike phalanx and the terrifying Indian war elephant, crashing directly into the rising power of the West. But the victory at Heraclea has revealed a chilling new reality. For his entire life, Pyrrhus has fought against other kings and mercenary armies. In the Greek world, war was almost like a violent game of chess. If you outmaneuvered an enemy king or killed his cavalry, the opposing army would simply surrender, drop their weapons, and often join your side. That was how Pyrrhus took Macedon without a fight. But the Roman Republic does not play by the rules of kings. As Pyrrhus walks among the thousands of bodies at Heraclea, he realizes that the Romans are not fighting for a paycheck, and they are not fighting for a warlord. They are citizen soldiers fighting for their home. Every single dead Roman is lying with his wounds on the front of his body. Not one man broke ranks to flee. Worse still, Pyrrhus knows that his own elite Epirot veterans, the men who have followed him for decades, are bleeding out in the mud, and they cannot be easily replaced from across the sea. The Romans, however, are simply retreating a few miles, tapping into the massive, seemingly endless manpower of central Italy, and raising a brand new army of enraged citizens. Pyrrhus has won the battle, but he has awakened a terrifying, relentless machine. He is a king who loves the glory of a quick, decisive victory, but he has just locked himself into a grinding war of absolute attrition against a people who simply do not know the meaning of the word surrender. In our next episode, the eagle will be forced to march deeper into the dark, wooded heart of Italy. We will follow him into a multi-day bloodbath that is so catastrophic, and so unimaginably costly, that it will permanently burn his name into the English language. We will witness his astonishing, sudden veto to fight a massive naval empire on the island of Sicily, and we will watch the tragic, bizarre unraveling of the greatest tactical genius of the ancient world.